Most people don't struggle with silence itself. They struggle with what silence makes them feel. It creates a space where there are no clear answers, no immediate reassurance, and no control. And in that space, the mind begins to fill in gaps. You start wondering what changed, what you did wrong, or whether something is fading. That discomfort pushes you toward action. You reach out, not always because you have something meaningful to say, but because you want to remove the uncertainty. In that moment, the message you send is not just communication, it is relief. Relief from not knowing. But here's what often goes unnoticed. Every time you step in to fill that silence, you interrupt a natural process that would have shown you something important. You replace observation with intervention. Instead of seeing whether the other person would have moved toward you, you move first. And when that becomes a pattern, you lose the ability to tell whether the connection exists on its own, or only continues because you keep it alive. Silence, when left alone, has a way of exposing reality without conflict or confrontation. It shows you who reaches out when there is no prompt, who thinks of you when there is no reminder, and who values the connection enough to step forward without being pulled. This is not about testing someone or creating distance as a strategy. It is about allowing behavior to emerge naturally. When you constantly maintain contact, you unintentionally remove the other person's responsibility to contribute. They don't need to initiate, because the connection is already being provided. Over time, this creates a dynamic where your effort becomes expected and their absence becomes normalized. Letting silence exist requires emotional discipline. It means tolerating the discomfort of not knowing for a little longer than you are used to. It means resisting the urge to immediately restore contact just to feel stable again. But in that restraint, something valuable happens. You begin to separate your emotional state from their behavior. You become less reactive and more observant. And from that place, you can see patterns more clearly. If someone values the connection, they will eventually close the gap. Not perfectly, not always on your timeline, but in a way that shows intention. And if they don't, the silence will extend without resistance. That is not rejection in a dramatic sense. It is simply information that was always there, now visible because you stopped covering it. Consistency is often overlooked because it does not create dramatic moments. It is quiet, steady, and easy to ignore when you are focused on isolated interactions that feel meaningful in the moment. Someone replies quickly one day, shows warmth in a conversation, or engages with interest for a short period of time, and it creates a sense of reassurance. You begin to believe that these moments represent the whole picture. But human connection is not built on occasional spikes of attention, it is built on patterns that repeat over time. Anyone can show interest when it is convenient, when they are in the right mood, or when they have nothing else competing for their attention. That kind of effort feels good, but it does not tell you much about their true level of investment. What matters more is what happens on the ordinary days, in the spaces where there is no pressure, no special context, and no prompting. Do they reach out when there is no reason to? Do they maintain the connection without being reminded? Do they show up in a way that feels stable rather than unpredictable? Inconsistent behavior creates confusion because it mixes signals. One moment suggests interest, the next suggests distance. This inconsistency often leads you to focus more on the positive moments because they give you something to hold on to. You begin to justify the gaps by telling yourself that everyone communicates differently or that timing is just off. But when you step back and look at the pattern as a whole, the truth becomes clearer. Consistency is not about constant attention or frequent messaging. It is about reliability. It is about knowing that the connection does not disappear unless you are the one holding it together. When someone is genuinely interested, their effort does not feel like something you have to question. It shows up in small, repeatable ways. They follow through. They engage without needing to be pulled into the conversation. They create a sense of continuity, where the connection feels alive even without effort from only one side. This does not mean perfection. People have busy days, distractions, and responsibilities. But even within that, there is a baseline of presence that remains intact. In contrast, occasional effort without consistency often keeps you in a cycle of uncertainty. You wait for the next moment of attention, hoping it will confirm what you want to believe. But each time it fades again, you are left in the same position, trying to interpret something that should not require interpretation. Over time, this becomes emotionally draining, not because of what is happening, but because of the constant need to make sense of it. When you start paying attention to consistency instead of moments, your perspective shifts. You stop being influenced by isolated interactions and begin to see the connection for what it actually is. This allows you to respond with clarity rather than assumption. You no longer chase brief signals of interest because you understand that real investment is not something that appears occasionally. It is something that remains visible, even in the simplest, most ordinary interactions. When communication becomes emotionally charged, most people stop listening to what is actually happening and start reacting to how it makes them feel. A delayed reply feels like distance. A short message feels like disinterest. Silence feels like rejection. And in that emotional interpretation, the conversation slowly stops being about two people exchanging words and starts becoming about one person trying to manage their internal uncertainty through the other person's responses. This is where emotional dependence quietly forms, not through big dramatic moments, but through small patterns where your inner state begins to shift based on external behavior. If a message comes quickly, you feel reassured. If it doesn't, you feel unsettled. Over time, your emotional stability becomes tied to something you do not control. And that creates a subtle but powerful imbalance in how you show up. When someone notices that their presence affects your emotional state too strongly, the dynamic changes, not necessarily because they intend it, but because human behavior naturally responds to pressure, even unspoken pressure. When your replies carry urgency, when your tone reflects waiting, when your attention feels dependent on their next move, it becomes harder for the interaction to feel relaxed or equal. What was once a simple exchange starts to feel like responsibility on one side and expectation on the other. Reclaiming emotional control does not mean becoming detached or indifferent. It means separating your internal world from external timing. It means recognizing that someone's response speed, tone, or frequency is not a measure of your value, but a reflection of their own priorities, attention, and circumstances. This shift is subtle, but it changes everything about how you communicate. When you are no longer emotionally anchored to immediate responses, your communication naturally becomes calmer. You stop rushing to fill silence. You stop over-explaining. You stop searching for reassurance in every message. Instead, you begin to respond from a grounded place where your words are not shaped by anxiety, but by clarity. And that clarity is felt on the other side. People notice when you are not speaking from neediness. There is less pressure in your tone, less urgency in your timing, and more presence in your words. This does not mean you care less. It means your care is no longer reactive. It is steady rather than unstable. And that steadiness changes how others engage with you, because it removes the feeling that they are responsible for your emotional balance. The most important part of emotional control is understanding that communication is information, not validation. A reply does not define your worth, and silence does not diminish it. Both simply reflect where the other person is in that moment. When you internalize this, you stop interpreting every interaction as a judgment of yourself. And slowly something shifts. You begin to notice that you are no longer waiting in the same way. You are no longer checking as often. You are no longer measuring your mood against someone else's attention. Your focus returns to your own life, your own rhythm, and your own sense of direction. From that place, communication becomes lighter, more intentional, and far less emotionally demanding. Most people misunderstand the role of presence in connection. They assume that being consistently available, consistently responsive, and consistently engaged is what builds closeness. But in reality, constant presence without balance can slowly weaken emotional impact. When something is always there, it stops creating space for anticipation. And without anticipation, emotional awareness begins to fade into routine. Human psychology responds strongly to contrast. We notice things because they change. We value things because they are not always immediately accessible. This is why absence, when understood correctly, is not a form of manipulation or emotional distance. It is a natural part of healthy connection. It creates space where awareness can grow. It allows both people to feel the difference between interaction and non-interaction, between presence and quiet. When someone is constantly available, responding instantly, initiating every conversation, and maintaining continuous contact, the relationship can lose its sense of texture. There is no breathing space, no moment where the other person has to think, reflect, or move toward the connection on their own. Over time, this can create a subtle imbalance, where one person becomes the default driver of interaction, while the other simply responds. Absence changes that dynamic not by force, but by space. When you stop overextending your availability, you allow natural behavior to surface. If someone is genuinely interested, they begin to feel your absence in a quiet way. not as pressure, but as awareness. They notice the shift in rhythm. They realize the absence of something they had become used to receiving without effort. And if there is real interest, that awareness often leads to initiative. They begin to check in. They begin to reach out. They begin to participate in maintaining the connection rather than simply receiving it. But absence does something even more important than revealing interest. It reveals dependency patterns. If the connection only feels alive when one person is constantly maintaining it, then absence exposes that reality without conflict or explanation. It shows whether the relationship has its own natural momentum, or whether it depends entirely on one person's continuous input. This is where emotional clarity begins, because when you remove constant presence, you stop guessing and start observing. You no longer rely on words or occasional moments of attention to define the situation. You see what remains when effort is no longer one-sided, and that clarity is often more valuable than comfort. However, absence is not about withdrawal or emotional games. It is not about disappearing to provoke a reaction. It is about restoring balance in how energy flows between two people. It is about stepping out of the role where you are always the initiator, always the maintainer, always the one bridging every gap. When that role is softened, the connection has a chance to reveal whether it can exist on mutual contribution. In that space, something important becomes visible. Real interest does not disappear when effort is no longer forced. It adjusts, it responds, it moves. And if it does not, then absence has already done its work. It has shown you what was being hidden beneath constant availability. When someone never initiates contact but still responds when you reach out, it creates a specific kind of emotional confusion. On the surface, the connection still exists. Messages are exchanged, conversations continue, and there is still a sense of engagement. But beneath that surface, there is an imbalance that becomes harder to ignore over time. You find yourself questioning what it means, wondering whether the interest is real, or whether you are simply maintaining something that would not exist without your effort. This is where many people unconsciously fall into a pattern of overfunctioning. They become the one who always starts conversations, always follows up, always fills silence before it becomes too uncomfortable. The problem is not effort itself. Effort is natural in connection. The problem begins when effort is one-sided and sustained, without reflection. When one person carries the momentum entirely, the dynamic stops revealing truth and starts preserving illusion. A connection where only one person initiates does not give a clear picture of mutual interest. It only shows what happens when one person consistently moves things forward. The other person's level of investment remains untested, not because it does not exist, but because it is never given space to express itself. As long as you are always the first to reach out, you remove the opportunity to observe whether they would do the same. This is why stepping back in a calm and intentional way becomes important. Not as punishment, not as a tactic, but as a way of restoring visibility. When you stop initiating everything, you create a natural pause in the pattern. And in that pause, behavior becomes more honest. If someone values the connection, they will eventually notice the shift. They will feel the absence of your usual presence. And from that awareness, they may choose to engage more actively. Not because they are forced to, but because they recognize the change. If nothing changes during that space, that information is just as important. Silence in this context is not emptiness. It is feedback. It tells you whether the connection has independent energy or whether it relies entirely on your effort to stay alive. Many people avoid this clarity because it can feel uncomfortable. It removes ambiguity, and with it certain hopes or assumptions. But clarity, even when difficult, is more useful than uncertainty that keeps you emotionally stuck. Testing interest in this way is not about creating emotional distance or playing games. It is about allowing reality to appear without interference. When you are always present, always initiating, always maintaining, you blur the natural signals that would otherwise guide your understanding. By stepping back slightly, you are not abandoning the connection. You are simply observing it without constant influence. And in that observation, patterns become visible. You begin to see whether communication is shared or carried, whether attention is mutual or conditional, whether the connection has its own rhythm or only moves when you push it forward. That understanding allows you to respond with more awareness and less assumption, grounding your decisions in behavior rather than hope or interpretation. At a certain point in emotional experiences, the real issue is no longer about how someone else behaves, but about what you are willing to accept as normal. Many people stay in situations where effort is uneven, communication is inconsistent, and emotional investment is one-sided, not because they do not see it, but because they gradually adjust their standards to fit what is available. Over time, what once felt insufficient begins to feel familiar, and familiarity often gets mistaken for stability. This is how standards quietly shift downward without conscious decision. It rarely happens in one moment. It happens through repetition. You explain away lack of effort. You interpret minimal attention as a busy phase. You convince yourself that potential matters more than present behavior. And slowly you begin to tolerate dynamics that do not actually meet your emotional needs. When standards are low, access becomes easy. Not because you are not valuable, but because you are not filtering behavior through self-respect. You remain present even when there is no real reciprocity. You continue investing even when investment is not being returned. And in doing so, you teach the situation that your presence does not require effort from the other side. Raising standards is not about becoming cold, distant, or overly selective. It is about becoming honest with yourself, about what consistency, respect, and mutual effort actually look like in practice. It means observing behavior without excuses, not focusing on what someone could be, but on what they repeatedly choose to do. When someone is truly aligned with you, effort does not feel like persuasion. You do not need to convince them to participate in communication. You do not need to interpret silence or decode mixed signals. Their presence is not something you have to maintain alone. It is something they contribute to naturally. But when standards are unclear, you often end up over-explaining, over-giving, and overstaying. You begin to measure the connection by how much you can tolerate rather than how much you are receiving. And that shift changes your entire emotional baseline. Instead of asking whether this connection feels balanced, you start asking whether you can endure it. Raising standards interrupts that pattern. It forces a moment of internal clarity, where you recognize that your time, attention, and emotional energy are not meant to be continuously extended toward situations that do not extend themselves back. It does not require confrontation, it requires awareness. And once that awareness is present, something subtle changes. Begin to respond differently. You stop rushing to fill silence. You stop justifying inconsistency. You stop confusing availability with compatibility. Instead, you start observing behavior as information rather than emotional noise. This shift also changes how others engage with you. When you no longer absorb imbalance without question, it becomes visible to the other person as well. Some will adjust their effort naturally when they recognize that access is not unlimited. Others will remain unchanged, which in itself becomes clarity. Ultimately, raising standards is not about controlling outcomes. It is about removing distortion. It allows you to see relationships as they are, not as you hope they could be. And from that clarity, your decisions become less emotional reaction and more grounded awareness of what is truly mutual and what is not.